I'm Jamie
Today, I want
Dimon.
to
I'm the
address the critical
CEO of
issues facing
JP
our
Morgan
organization.
Chase,
We must
and I'm
unite
going to
and
tell
move
you
forward
about
with
the
a clear
hidden
vision for
enemy
the
that's
future.
destroying your
Today, I want
savings,
to address the critical
inflation.
issues facing
But
our
this isn't
organization. We must
ordinary
unite and
inflation.
move forward
This
with
is
a
a
clear vision for the
systematic
future.
wealth transfer
Today, I
that's
want to
robbing
address the critical
retirees,
issues
and the
facing our
worst part
organization.
is
We must
the
unite
government
and
is
move
doing
forward
it
with a
on
clear vision for the
purpose.
future.
Last week,
Today,
I
I want
walked
to
out of the
address the
latest
critical
Fed
issues
meeting.
facing our
I spoke
organization.
privately
We
with
must
Jerome
unite and
Powell.
move forward
I
with a
said
clear
to him,
vision for the future.
Jerome,
Today, I
inflation
want
is
to
at
address the critical issues
3.2%,
facing our
but for
organization. We
retirees,
must unite
real
and move
inflation
forward
is
with a clear
over
vision for the future.
8%. Why
Today, I
isn't
want to
anyone
address the
talking
critical
about
issues
this?
facing our organization.
His
We must
answer
unite
shocked
and
me.
move forward with a clear
Jamie,
vision for the
if we
future.
release those
Today, I
numbers,
want
we'd
to
create
address the critical
social
issues
unrest.
facing our organization.
Because here's
We
the
must
truth.
unite and
The
move forward
government's
with a clear
reported
vision for the
inflation
future.
numbers are
Today, I
lies when
want
it
to
comes to
address the
older
critical issues
Americans.
facing our
The
organization.
CPI
We must
basket is
unite
designed
and move
around
forward
young
with a clear
workers'
vision
spending
for the future.
habits. But
Today, I want to
retirees buy
address the
different
critical issues
things,
facing our
and those things are
organization. We
rising
must
in
unite
price
and move
much
forward with a
faster.
clear vision for the future.
Let me give you the
Today, I
numbers.
want to
Over
address
the
the
last
critical
5
issues facing
years,
our
health
organization.
insurance
We must
premiums
unite
up
and move forward with a clear
47%,
vision for the
prescription
future.
drug prices up
Today, I want to address
52%,
the critical
home.
issues facing our
Healthcare
organization.
services
We
up
must unite and move forward
61%.
with a clear
These are
vision for the future.
retirees' basic
Today, I want to
necessities,
address the
and
critical
none of
issues
this is
facing our
properly
organization.
reflected in
We must
official
unite
inflation
and move forward with a
statistics.
clear vision
But
for the
that's
future.
just the beginning.
Today, I want to
The
address
real
the critical
disaster
issues
is
facing
in
our
housing.
organization. We
Retirees
must unite
typically
and move
sell their
forward with
homes
a
and
clear vision for the
downsize,
future.
but housing
Today, I want
prices
to
are up
address the critical issues facing
73%.
our organization.
Rental
We must
prices up
unite and move forward with a clear
85%.
vision for the future.
Even when
Today, I
seniors
want
sell
to
their
address the
houses,
critical
they
issues
can't
facing our
afford to buy or
organization.
rent
We must
anything
unite
else.
and move forward
Why
with a
does the
clear vision
government
for the
hide
future.
these numbers?
Today, I want
Because
to
Social
address the
Security
critical issues
payments are
facing our
indexed to
organization. We
inflation.
must unite
If
and
they
move
revealed
forward with a
real
clear vision for
inflation,
the future.
they'd have to
Today, I
increase
want
Social
to address
Security
the critical
payments
issues
by the
facing our
same amount.
organization. We must
But there's
unite
no
and move
money in the
forward with a
vault,
clear vision
so
for
the
the future.
CPI is
Today, I want
manipulated.
to address
They
the
make
critical issues facing
hedonic
our organization.
adjustments.
We must unite and
Nonsense
move
like
forward with
not
a clear
counting
vision for the
price
future.
increases
Today, I
when
want to
technology
address the
products
critical issues
improve in
facing our
quality.
organization. We
But
must
nobody
unite and
tells
move forward with a clear
retirees,
vision for
your
the future.
computer is
Today,
faster,
I
so
want
it
to
doesn't
address
matter
the
that
critical
bread
issues
costs
facing our
more.
organization.
The
We
result?
must unite and move forward with a
Retirees
clear
lose
vision for the
5
future.
to 8%
Today,
of
I
their
want
real
to address the
purchasing
critical
power
issues
every
facing
year,
our
but
organization.
official
We
numbers
must
show
unite
only
and move forward
3%
with a clear vision
inflation,
for the
and
future.
Social
Today, I
Security
want to
payments
address the
only
critical
increased
issues
by
facing our
3%.
organization. We must unite and
Over
move forward
10
with a clear
years,
vision for the future.
retirees have lost
Today, I want to
40%
address
of their
the critical
purchasing
issues facing
power.
our organization. We must
So how is
unite
this
and move forward
fixed?
with a clear vision
It's
for the
not.
future.
Because
Today, I want
inflation
to
is
address the
intentional
critical issues
policy.
facing our organization.
It's the
We must
easiest way
unite
to
and move
erode
forward
government
with a clear
debt.
vision for the
How are they
future.
going to pay off
Today, I want to
$35
address
trillion
the
in
critical
debt?
issues
They're
facing
going
our
to inflate
organization.
it
We must
away,
unite
but
and move forward with a
retirees
clear
pay
vision
the
for the
price.
future.
The
Today, I
Fed's
want
real
to address
target
the
isn't
critical issues
2%
facing our
inflation,
organization.
it's
We must
4,
unite and move forward
5%
with a clear vision
inflation,
for the future.
but they can't say
Today,
that
I want to
publicly.
address the critical
Because
issues
people
facing our
would revolt,
organization. We
so
must
they
unite
report
and move
inflation
forward with a
lower
clear
than it
vision for the
really
future.
is and call it
Today, I want to
transitory.
address the critical issues
We've had
facing our
transitory
organization. We must
inflation for
unite and
4
move
years
forward with a
now.
clear vision for the future.
But here's the truly
Today, I want
shocking
to
part.
address the
This
critical issues
inflation
facing our
is
organization.
deliberately
We must
targeting
unite and move forward
retirees.
with a clear vision for
Young
the
workers
future.
can get salary increases. They can change jobs. They have bargaining power. But retirees are on fixed incomes. They have no income sources other than Social Security. And that income lags behind inflation. This is systematic elderly robbery. They're stealing older American savings to pay for younger generations' debts, and they call it monetary policy. Here's what happened in 2023 that proves this is intentional. The Bureau of Labor Statistics quietly changed how they calculate housing costs in the CPI. They switched from actual rental prices to owner's equivalent rent, a made-up number based on what homeowners think they could rent their houses for. Why did they make this change? Because actual rental prices were rising so fast, they would have pushed official inflation over 6%. But seniors don't live in imaginary rental markets. They live in real ones where rents have doubled. Meanwhile, the Fed kept saying inflation was under control, while grocery prices rose 25%, utility bills rose 40%, and car insurance rose 60%. These aren't luxury items. These are necessities that hit fixed-income seniors hardest. But the most insidious part of this policy is how it's hidden from public view. When politicians talk about inflation, they use the manipulated CPI numbers. When they talk about helping seniors, they point to Social Security cost of living adjustments based on those same fake numbers. So seniors get a 3% increase in benefits while facing 8% increases in their actual living costs. The gap widens every year. And politicians act confused about why so many elderly Americans are struggling financially. This is where I'll tell you about the real scope of this disaster. The real scope of this disaster becomes clear clear when you look at what inflation has done to different types of savings. Cash savings, CDs, money market accounts, the safe investments that retirees rely on, have been completely destroyed by negative real interest rates. Here's the math that should terrify every retiree. If you have $100,000 in a savings account earning 1% interest and real inflation for seniors is 8%, you're losing $7,000 per year in purchasing power. Over 10 years, that $100,000 becomes worth about $50,000 in today's buying power. But it gets worse. The government's zero interest rate policy from 2010 to 2022 was specifically designed to punish savers and reward borrowers. They called it financial repression, deliberately keeping interest rates below inflation to reduce government debt burdens. Who got hurt? Retirees who saved responsibly their entire lives. Who got helped? The government, which could borrow money for free, and young people with student loans and mortgages who benefited from artificially low rates. Stop here, because this detail changes everything about how you should think about government economic policy. This isn't incompetence. This is deliberate wealth redistribution from old to young, from savers to debtors, from prudent to reckless. But the truly shocking part had not been revealed yet. The inflation tax hits retirees harder than any other group because they can't adjust their income sources. Workers can demand raises, change jobs, start side businesses. Retirees are trapped with fixed incomes that lose value every day. Let me tell you about a conversation I had with a 72-year-old client that opened my eyes to how devastating this policy has become. She came to my office in tears. She had $500,000 in CDs and savings when she retired in 2019. She thought she was financially secure. But by 2024, the purchasing power of that money had fallen to about $320,000. Her grocery bill had doubled. Her utility bills had tripled. Her prescription drug costs had quadrupled. The safe investments her financial advisor recommended had been systematically destroyed by inflation. She said to me, "Jamie, I did everything right. I saved money my whole life. I lived below my means. I invested conservatively. How am I getting poorer every year?" I couldn't give her a satisfactory answer because the truth would have been too upsetting. The truth is that her savings were being confiscated through monetary policy to pay for government spending she never voted for. The inflation tax is the most regressive tax in existence, and it hits hardest on people who can least afford it. Here's what the data shows about how inflation affects different age groups. Americans under 35 actually benefited from recent inflation because their wages rose faster than their living costs, and many had fixed-rate mortgages that became cheaper to pay off with inflated dollars. Americans over 65 were devastated. Their incomes are mostly fixed. They don't have mortgages to inflate away. They spend disproportionately on healthcare and housing, which rose fastest. And they hold most of their wealth in cash and bonds, which lost the most value. This isn't an accident. It's the predictable result of policies designed to benefit younger generations at the expense of older ones. The government borrowed trillions during COVID and is now inflating away that debt using retirees' savings as collateral. But here's what happened in late 2023 that convinced me this policy is accelerating. The Fed started talking about allowing inflation to run moderately above their 2% target to make up for years when it was below target. They called it average inflation targeting. What this really means is deliberate higher inflation for several more years. They're not trying to get inflation back to 2%. They're trying to average 2% over a long period, which means years of 4 to 5% inflation to make up for previous years of low inflation. For retirees, this is a death sentence. Their savings are being systematically destroyed to pay for government fiscal irresponsibility. And there's no end in sight because the government's debt burden makes low inflation politically impossible. So far, you've only seen how inflation destroys cash savings, but the damage goes much deeper into every aspect of retirement security. The damage goes much deeper because inflation doesn't just erode cash savings. It destroys the entire foundation of retirement planning that Americans have been taught to rely on for decades. The traditional advice, save money in safe investments, live off the interest and dividends, has been made impossible by deliberate government policy. Think about what retirees were told to do. Work for 40 years, save money in banks and CDs, maybe buy some bonds, keep your money safe, don't take risks, live off the income. This advice worked when interest rates were higher than inflation. But it's been financial suicide for the last 15 years. Here's why this is so devastating. Retirees can't just adjust their portfolios like younger investors. They don't have time to recover from losses. They can't wait for markets to recover. They need income today to pay today's bills. But safe income has been destroyed by zero interest rate policy. A retiree who followed traditional advice and kept $500,000 in CDs earning 5% could live comfortably on $25,000 per year in income without touching the principal. But when rates were pushed to zero, that same $500,000 earned maybe $1,000 per year. To get the same income, they had to spend down their principal. But here's where it gets truly evil. At the same time, the government destroyed safe returns for savers. They created massive asset bubbles in stocks and real estate. This forced retirees into riskier investments just to generate income. Pension funds, insurance companies, individual retirees, everyone was pushed up the risk curve. The result was predictable. When COVID hit and markets crashed, retirees who had been forced into risky investments saw their portfolios decimated. Meanwhile, young people with stable jobs could buy the dip and benefit from the recovery. Once again, the elderly got crushed while the young prospered. But the decision no one expected came next. I realized that J.P. Morgan needed to completely rethink how we advise clients about retirement income. The old models were broken. We needed strategies that could work in a high-inflation, low real return environment. We started recommending things that would have been considered radical for retirees just 10 years ago. Real estate investment trusts to hedge inflation, international stocks to escape dollar debasement, even some commodity exposure to protect against supply chain inflation. Most importantly, we started telling clients to plan for much higher inflation than official projections. If the government says inflation will average 2%, plan for 5%. If they say Social Security will maintain purchasing power, assume it won't. The government's incentives are to lie about inflation, so don't trust their numbers. But here's what surprised me about how clients responded to this advice. They weren't shocked. They already knew their living costs were rising much faster than official inflation numbers suggested. They were just grateful someone in authority was finally confirming what they experienced daily. That's when I realized something important about the inflation crisis. It's not hidden from regular people. They know exactly what's happening because they live it every day. The only people pretending inflation isn't a crisis are politicians and economists who don't live on fixed incomes. Here's what happened in 2024 that proved how bad this crisis has become for retirees. For the first time since the Great Depression, more Americans over 65 entered poverty than escaped it. Retirement, which used to provide economic security, has become a pathway to financial hardship for millions. The causes are clear. Savings destroyed by negative real interest rates, living costs rising faster than Social Security adjustments, healthcare expenses growing at double-digit rates while Medicare coverage shrinks. It's a perfect storm of policies that penalize people for aging. This brings me to the conversation that made me realize how this crisis is reshaping American families and society. The conversation was with the adult daughter of one of our longtime clients. Her mother was 78, had been widowed 3 years earlier, and was struggling financially despite having over $300,000 in savings when her husband died. The daughter said, "Jamie, my mom was middle class her whole life. She saved money, owned her home, did everything right. Now I'm paying her grocery bills because her savings aren't enough." This story is becoming typical. Adult children in their 50s and 60s who should be maximizing their own retirement savings are instead supporting parents whose fixed incomes can't keep up with inflation. It's destroying 2 generations' financial security simultaneously. Here's what the data shows about this multi-generational wealth destruction. 40% of Americans between ages 50-65 are now providing financial support to aging parents. The average amount is $1,000 per month. Over 10 years, that's $104,000 that isn't going into their own retirement savings. Meanwhile, those same middle-aged Americans are dealing with their own inflation crisis. Their wages aren't keeping up with real costs either. So they're getting squeezed from both directions, supporting parents whose savings have been inflated away while watching their own savings lose purchasing power. But the truly shocking part had not been revealed yet. This isn't just affecting individual families, it's creating a systemic economic crisis that threatens the entire consumer economy. When retirees have less spending power, when adult children are supporting parents instead of spending on themselves, total consumer demand falls. Consumer spending drives 70% of the U.S. economy, and the demographic that should be entering their peak spending years, people in their 50s and 60s with high incomes and paid-off mortgages, are instead cutting back to support inflation-impoverished parents. The ripple effects are already visible. Restaurants, retail stores, travel companies, all reporting that their core customer base of affluent older Americans is spending less, not because they want to, but because inflation has destroyed their purchasing power. Let me give you some numbers that show how severe this has become. The average retiree household spends $4,000 per month on basic living expenses. In 2019, that same basket of goods and services cost $2,800. That's a 43% increase in just 5 years. But Social Security payments over the same period increased by only 18%. Medicare premiums increased by 35%, so the net Social Security increase was minimal. The gap between income and expenses has grown from manageable to catastrophic for millions of retirees. Here's what happened in my own family that made this crisis personal for me. My aunt, who's 82, called me last month in tears. She's been forced to choose between her prescription medications and adequate food. Her drug costs alone now consume 40% of her Social Security check. She worked as a teacher for 35 years, saved money diligently, owns her home outright. By all traditional measures, she should be financially secure, but inflation has made her basic living expenses unaffordable on her fixed income. This is happening to millions of Americans who did everything society told them to do. They worked, saved, lived within their means, but government monetary policy has made their careful planning irrelevant. Their purchasing power is being systematically destroyed. During that period, people ask me what retirees can do to protect themselves from inflation when they're on fixed incomes and can't take investment risks. My answer was difficult to hear. There are no good options for people already retired when inflation accelerates beyond their control. But most importantly, understand that this crisis represents a fundamental breakdown in the social contract between generations and between citizens and government. This crisis represents a fundamental breakdown in the social contract that has governed American society for the past century. The basic deal was simple. Work hard, save money, follow the rules, and you'll have economic security in retirement. That deal has been broken by deliberate government policy. The implications go far beyond individual financial hardship. When an entire generation discovers that their lifetime of savings has been systematically confiscated through monetary policy, trust in institutions collapses. When people realize the government deliberately lies about inflation to avoid paying fair Social Security adjustments, faith in democratic processes erodes. This is why the inflation crisis is more dangerous than most people understand. It's not just about higher prices at the grocery store. It's about the legitimacy of the entire economic and political system. When institutions betray the people who trusted them most, societies become unstable. Here's what I learned about inflation's social effects from studying similar crises in other countries. The pattern is always the same. First, governments create inflation to solve fiscal problems. Then, they lie about inflation to avoid paying fair adjustments to retirees. Finally, social unrest follows as people realize they've been systematically robbed. Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, Zimbabwe. Every country that has used inflation as fiscal policy has seen the same result: social breakdown, political instability, and economic collapse. The people hurt most are always the elderly, because they can't adjust their incomes or change their behavior to adapt to the new reality. That's what America is facing now. We're not Zimbabwe, but we're following the same playbook: borrow massively, then inflate away the debt using retirees' savings as collateral. The scale is different, but the mechanism and the victims are the same. Here's what this means for anyone trying to build retirement security in an environment where the government actively destroys purchasing power. First, don't trust official inflation statistics. Plan for inflation rates 2 to 3 percentage points higher than government projections. Second, don't hold significant amounts of cash or bonds for long periods. These assets are specifically targeted by inflationary policy. You need assets that can adjust to inflation: real estate, commodities, stocks of companies that can raise prices. Third, understand that traditional retirement planning advice is obsolete. The 4% withdrawal rule, bond ladders, CD strategies, all of this assumes a world where governments try to maintain price stability. That world no longer exists. Fourth, prepare for much higher healthcare and housing costs than official projections suggest. These are the categories where inflation hits retirees hardest, and they're also the categories where government price controls and subsidies hide the true rate of inflation. But most importantly, recognize that individual preparation isn't enough when government policy is actively working against savers. This is a political problem that requires political solutions, not just better personal financial planning. I'm Jamie Dimon. I'm 67 years old. I've managed trillions of dollars through multiple inflation cycles. And I'm telling you that the current inflation represents a systematic wealth transfer from retirees to the government. It's not accidental, it's not temporary, and it's not going to stop without major political change. The government has chosen inflation as the solution to unsustainable debt levels. They've chosen to pay their bills by making your savings worth less every year. They've chosen to balance their budgets by destroying your purchasing power. Your savings aren't safe from inflation because inflation is the policy. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, and Congress have all agreed that moderate inflation is acceptable if it reduces debt burdens. What they don't say publicly is that your purchasing power is the collateral. If you're retired or approaching retirement, understand that the traditional advice about conservative investing and fixed incomes is not just outdated. It's been deliberately sabotaged by government policy. The rules of the game have changed, and the new rules are designed to transfer wealth from savers to debtors. The inflation that's eating your savings isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. And it will continue until either the debt problem is solved or the political consequences become too severe for politicians to ignore. That's the brutal truth about inflation and retirement security in America today. Your purchasing power is being systematically destroyed to solve problems you didn't create by people who won't live with the consequences.